Hi, I'm Jim Krenslick from the Daily News. I'm joined today by Genesee County historian Michael Eula, who tonight will be in the Oakfield Community and Government Center in Oakfield to give a presentation on basically how Italians went from being this other on the fringes of society
Yes.
to something that just kind of ingrained in our society. Michael, first of all, thank you for coming out. I hope a
Thank
lot
you
of
for
people
having me.
find out about this event and check it out. But I guess just to start, it's nothing without having a historical interest yourself. Where did this idea of wanting to track how I guess they went from being Italians to Italian Americans right here locally?
Right.
Where did that come from?
I know we had two Americans, so there's a whole
Yeah.
process here. And of course, there's still a pretty huge debate about how much assimilation and what forms that took, Italian Americans and otherwise. But my own interest it starts with just a very passionate interest about the history of Genesee County and in all of its manifestations. And I thought that this was certainly one area that needed to be explored more than it has been.
And sort of this is an idea, I will kind of get into this, of how generations, they evolve and sort of maybe they lose a little bit of history. But let's kind of bring it back to where I guess this starts in, I guess, the 1880s, 1890s?
Well, of course, there were a handful of Italian immigrants here as early as the late 18th century. We have the Buste monuments in
Yes.
front of the Holland Land Office. But the bulk of the immigration begins after the Civil War, and unlike the earlier waves of immigration, it was from southern Italy. And one could argue to this day that there were really two Italys. There's the Italy north of Rome, and then the Italy south of Rome, which is a distinctly different area. And that, of course, is where most of the Italian immigrants came from.
And I think that's something that even holds true today. Like the visions that we might have of Italy now, there's part of it is sort of this rustic and part of it is sort of very cosmopolitan.
Yes.
And that divide is right there.
And we see that here locally. In my research, looking at various newspaper accounts in the period before the Civil War, Italy and Italians are depicted in very favorable terms. It's the land of culture and the land of art. With the arrival of, for the most part, illiterate peasants from the Mezzogiorno, from southern Italy, we start to see very different depictions as we enter the early 20th century. So the initial generation of Italian arrivals are arriving in an America which is increasingly hostile. And of course, that really doesn't start to change. I would argue the turning point is World War II and beyond.
So why are these Italian immigrants coming to Genesee County and that, I guess, that wave of immigration?
Well, of course, we need to keep in mind that the focus of their destination is south of here in New York City. And what's often forgotten as well is that there are almost as many immigrants going to South America at the time, Argentina in particular. That's a whole other aspect here, which would go beyond our discussion. But those coming to northern or upper New York state, I should say, are coming here because of the opportunities in places like the gypsum mine and also the opportunities to work in agricultural pursuits, which of course is what they were used to as peasants in southern Italy.
So when they first start coming here, I know there's a lot of activity around the quarries, and gypsum is going to be no different. Your presentation tonight is going to be kind of along the lines of, I guess, there are two trigger incidents that really show where the fault lines were in this, and I think you kind of laid it out in 1905. There is a worker who is killed,
Yes.
actually, while working in the mine.
There are two workers in 1905 that are killed. Of course, one of them is an Italian immigrant. And then that prompts very heated discussions about the working conditions in the mines. And this, of course, is happening at a time where America is industrializing and there is a good amount of labor unrest throughout the country. What's taking place at the gypsum mines is not an exception in 1905.
And I guess within a year after that, there's actually these reports of, okay, there's a strike going on, and basically the strike breakers are these New York City Italians,
Yes.
and they're viewed as basically this horde that's, coming. People are basically getting their arsenals of weaponry ready just in case this is some sort of violent, upheaval.
Yes, and again, what's taking place in Oakfield in 1905, 1906 is not untypical in the country at large. What is untypical here, and I developed that later on in the talk, is that unlike a place like New York City, in large part because it's a rural area, it's much easier in a shorter amount of time for Italian immigrants and their descendants in particular to start to move into the mainstream of society. There's something about large concentrations in urban areas that tend to separate people along ethnic lines much more readily than you see in a rural area such as this. In this way, Genesee County is very much like the far west. Italians go into, say, California or to other parts of the West much more readily are able to assimilate, even in the years before World War II, than we see in an urban area like New York City.
Is it something where the people arriving are changing, or is it the people that were already here that were changing? What is the factor that made this specifically possible?
I think part of the answer is that for those who are able to work the land, they are comfortable continuing to have a relationship, frankly, with the earth that was something that was the norm in southern Italy. Going to New York City was traumatic, not only because of arrival in the United States and all that suggested, but also because they were arriving in a new city. I mean, if you look at the Italian peasant dialects, they didn't have words for things like subway cars, and so it was a radical adjustment, and some adjusted better than others. In this part of the state, it was much easier for agricultural workers to find a niche early on.
Everyone has a word and a concept of what a plow is.
Right.
And I guess as that happens, so you kind of said World War II is kind of the touchstone of this.
Yes.
Is it something where maybe after the war, how has this continued to maybe evolve over the last 2 or 3 generations?
Well, I would go back a step for a moment. I talk about, for example, the activity of the Ku Klux Klan in Genesee County in 1924. And again, this is not untypical at the time, because in the early 1920s, Klan membership around the country had grown dramatically for a whole variety of reasons, including anti-immigrant perspectives at the time. After World War II, along with the simple fact that about 1 million Italian Americans serve in the armed forces, there is a general repugnance directed against any group that is fostering racial hatred in the wake of Nazism. So the Klan falls out of disrepute.
And that's, and it's something where people are just allowed to be. And,
Yes.
And we incorporated it, and it almost becomes this idea of, okay, Italian culture becomes American culture. It's as a Polak,
Right.
Eating spaghetti might not be as good as someone's grandmother's recipe. You're still having the basic same elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Frank Sinatra makes a documentary before the war's even over. It's a famous one in which he has around him Americans of every different background one could think of. And this idea that to be an American is to not be identified as one in racial or ethnic terms, but in terms of our core beliefs, especially in the wake of fighting fascism in World War II.
It is becoming, I guess, American. Is that the last stage of this transformation? Is there another step here that might still yet happen?
Well, I would say that probably, but I can't guarantee it. This would be the final step. I mean, one of the striking patterns among Italian immigrants and their descendants in Genesee County, and I would argue this is true for the nation as a whole, is that there is a widespread movement into the middle class. Formal educational levels increase dramatically, business ownership, property ownership, which was always important to peasants who couldn't have imagined owning land in southern Italy. So by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, not to mention beyond, people could speak of an Italian ancestry, but more than anything else, we're talking about middle-class Americans at that point, virtually indistinguishable from the surrounding population. Not to mention also rates of intermarriage over time.
And I guess just beyond this, so just to reset, you're gonna give a presentation along these lines tonight in Oakfield. And it's part of not only the Oakfield Historical Society, but also Go Arts, Genesee Orleans Cultural Connect series. What do you hope comes out of doing a presentation like this?
Well, one of the things I've always hoped, whenever I've explored this topic, Genesee County or otherwise, is that people remember that there is a clear complexity to American life beyond the relatively simple and misleading notions of white, black, brown. Within each of those categories, there's enormously different histories and interactions. So the history of Italian Americans is really one that is the history of a very complicated American picture. It's not simply a couple of groups and that's it.
Well, Michael, I know as Genesee County historian, you're going to have a lot of fun unpacking those narratives. But again, thank you for coming out today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Good luck tonight.
Thank
Hopefully,
you.
it's not this horde of people we might have been afraid of 110 years ago.
No, I doubt that seriously.
All right. Well, thanks, and everybody, thank you for watching.
Thank you.